Alright everybody, today's lecture is going to be on visible light. And we'll start off by talking about white light. So white light is comprised of all the colors of visible light. You guys have probably learned this before. If you shine it through a prism, you'll end up splitting that white light into all the colors of the spectrum. And remember, we're talking the spectrum as like the electromagnetic, like visible light spectrum. So we're talking different wavelengths of light. And that's something to remember actually through this whole lecture. When we're talking about color, we're specifically talking about wavelengths of light. Let's take a look at this video. It's a little off-center, but the actual part of the video is nice and center. So they're shining white light through this prism. And you'll notice right here, or maybe a second before that, right here we see white light. It's not really shining directly into us, into our eye, right into the camera. This is our white light here. This is our prism. And you can see the spectrum that it's splitting it into. And I really like what they do here because they pan the camera over to the right. And as they go, you're starting to see the red light that's being split. Then you're going to go to orange, then yellow. It's going to start turning into green, then cyan, then blue. It's going to get a little bit down to, the violet's a little shorter, right? You don't quite see it all. It's maybe purplish right there. Then it's white again. So you notice we don't have a lot of a spectrum for purple or violet in our eye. We don't see it. It's right at the edge of what we can see. So I think this is a really cool example where you pan the camera across a split prismed white light and you see the entire spectrum shining through. They also kind of show it along the end of the ray where it's split further and further apart, and you see almost what amounts to a rainbow. So we need to get into, or we're going to get into, two color theories. But before we do that, we have to identify how light's being transmitted into our eyes. So light can be emitted by something, and light can be reflected by something. So light emitters include all the light sources that we've talked about so far. So bioluminescent and fluorescent and incandescent, those all create light. They're all using like a chemical reaction or something else to create light. Some kind of transfer of energy or release of energy. And when light's emitted, and the color of light that can go directly into our eye is controlled by the actual emitter itself. Okay, so it's sending out a certain wavelength of light. So there's TV, computer screens, like your phone, glow sticks, all these things are emitters of light. And this is a really cool close-up of pixels on a TV screen, where each pixel is actually red, green, and blue, and that's it. And through a mixture of these things, it can create a full picture image with proper color definition. So I always think that's maybe one of the most fascinating things. Light reflectors are a little different than emitters. These are basically everything else, everything that isn't an emitter. So when light's reflecting off of something, there's an added level of complexity, and that's that the surface that the light is reflecting off of absorbs some of the wavelengths of light, unless it's white. But if you're looking at, say your hand, you put your hand out in front of you, and you can see your hand, but your hand isn't emitting light, right? It's just having light bounce off of it into your eye, and then your eye is transferring that up to your brain and creating an image. But the color of your hand is fairly complex, right? There's a lot of different variation. There's tonal variation. You can sometimes see veins under your skin or imperfections in your skin. And that's because different parts of your body, or different parts like your skin and your veins and your nails, are absorbing different wavelengths of light and reflecting different wavelengths of light. All the wavelengths that bounce off of something and go into your eye are the colors you're going to see something as. Where the rest of the colors that you don't see, like maybe you don't see green in your hand, your hand is actually going to absorb those wavelengths of light. So notice this room here is maybe a bad maybe a bad example because it's mostly white. If something is white, it means it's reflecting all the colors, all the wavelengths. Because as we saw in the prism, if you take all of those wavelengths and you put them together, you end up with white light. So this, again, is just saying most of what we see is reflected light. So let's talk about additive theory. This is our first of two color theories. For describing how to predict or manipulate how light will work with an emitter, it's useful to use additive theory. Additive theory describes how we can take red, blue, and green light, these are our primary colors that we might be familiar with, and add it together to make all our other colors. So you notice you take blue and you take red, you get some kind of like pinkish purple magenta. You take green, you take blue, you get a cyan. You take red and green, you get a yellow. And then you have white there. And some people talk about how, I guess this is a bit of an aside, primary colors with like painting were like red, yellow, and blue. So kind of green and yellow were swapped there. These are primary colors for additive theory. So there's different types of primary colors for different things. These are the ones we're going to use for additive theory, okay? Blue, red, and green. And additive theory makes a lot of sense when you're talking about something emitting light. LEDs are a good example to discuss because they basically just use red, green, or blue, like we showed over here. And using these two colors mixed together, they can make our brains perceive the entire spectrum of color. And we'll talk about a weird problem with that at the end of the video, because essentially what's happening is you're taking red and green on all your little pixels, and if you show red and green on all these, you're going to perceive something like yellow. And if you show blue and green, you're going to perceive kind of a cyan color. And these two colors are in between. Red, like yellow is in between red and green on the spectrum, and cyan is in between blue and green on the spectrum. Purple's a little weird though, because it's at the end of the spectrum, and it's not in between red and blue. So that's something we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. It's a little funky. The other theory that we need to know about is subtractive theory. So for describing how to predict or manipulate light, how light will work, when it's reflected, we use subtractive theory. So subtractive theory uses the idea that every surface is going to absorb some wavelengths and reflect others. And we have different primary colors for this. We have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Black is actually, it's more of a technical thing. When all those are added up, you get black. And black is important to use for printing, and this is often where CYM or these primary colors are used, is in printing. You'll notice too, sorry, before we go on, this is cyan, magenta, and yellow. They become the primaries here, and then they have red, blue, and green as their secondary colors. So they're kind of like inverted color wheels. The idea going from this is why it's called additive. You're adding light to something that has no light, a situation that has no light, versus you're removing light from something. That's why it's called subtractive theory. So the most basic example of subtractive theory is shining a white light on a simple object and seeing what happens. Because you're shining all the types of light onto something, and then you're seeing what is reflected back into your eye. So if you shone a light on a red rose, then the red petals, you'd be seeing this. This is what's reflecting, which means something has to be taken away, which would be cyan. Cyan's being taken away from the light bouncing off the rose. So when you shine a white light onto a red rose or a red object, any red object, it's absorbing cyan wavelengths, and then some magenta and some yellow are bouncing back into your eye and giving you the perception of red. That's the idea. Subtractive theory for bananas, you'd have yellow bananas, which means that the bananas are absorbing both cyan and magenta, because those two are being taken away, and you're left with just yellow. if you have a blue water bottle, you know it's probably absorbing yellow light, reflecting a bit of magenta, a bit of cyan, so you get blue. And keep in mind, all these things are going to be in continuums. Different shades are going to absorb different amounts of each type of light. So let's talk about purple and magenta. I'm going to have you guys watch that video. It's maybe about 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Watch that video when you have a chance. It does a really good job of explaining this. And I'll give you a brief overview here. And if that's enough, that's cool. But I highly advise you guys to watch that video. So when we have, like we said, we have seeing red, we have seeing green. And when you mix those together, you get something in the middle. You get yellow. Or we have seeing green and seeing blue or purple. And you mix those together and you kind of get a cyan somewhere in the middle. But when you see blue and you see red mixed together, you don't get green. Your brain actually mixes those two colors and makes up another color, which is purple or magenta, because it wants to say that you've got this color, but the cones in your eye that see that color are not activated at all. So when you see this blue and this red mixed together and you can't take them apart, when both of these cones are being fired, but this one isn't, your brain just creates a color to fill in that space. So purple's kind of like this weird made-up color. It's pretty bizarre. You guys can look into it more if you want, but I think that's really cool. And the last thing I want to talk about, because it seems appropriate for this discussion, is Vanta Black. I don't know if you guys have looked this up. If you haven't, I highly suggest you do. Vanta Black, I think, is the darkest substance in the world. It may have changed. There's always cutting-edge new stuff. But it's a nanotube material that absorbs 99.965% of all visible light. So that's a lot. And this means some weird things. So YouTube some videos if you want. It's easier to see in video than it is in picture. But this is a good example where this tinfoil is crumpled up. Like the whole tinfoil is crumpled up. And then this section is sprayed with Vanta Black. And it's still crumpled up. You just can't see that it's crumpled because there's not enough light bouncing off of all those little edges back into your eye for you to discern any sort of texture. And this is just like a round disc with Vanta Black, but it looks like a photoshopped circle. Because with Vanta Black, it's it's got super hard edges, which feel very unnatural. Nothing really has that, because generally around the edge of something, there's some sort of light wrapping, or light goes through like if you look at the edge of your skin under light, or you put your hand over top some light, you'll see that there's a bit of a glow around the edges, like kind of a reddish glow or something, because light kind of goes through your skin a little bit, and then you can see the light that's colored from that. No light goes through the edges of this. It just gets completely absorbed, or almost completely absorbed. So the edges look really stark and weird and unnatural. So yeah, check out some videos. It's a little more striking in videos. And that's it for today, guys. Cheers.